Well, welcome everyone back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Those of you who have joined us many times will know that we are the UK's leading pro-marriage organisation, and we represent individuals and groups, tens of thousands of people up and down the UK who really support this notion of one man, one woman marriage. And as I often say straight away, that doesn't mean other things don't exist in a liberal democracy. Clearly they do, but we think one man, one woman marriage is unique, and all the evidence would suggest that it's precious in society. It delivers benefits that nothing else is able to deliver. And we think it needs to be preserved, it needs to be protected, it needs to be promoted. And that's what our organisation, that's what this channel is all about. And part of that promotion, of course, focuses around education, the education system, all things to do with education. It's a real privilege to have with us today somebody called Alan Lansdowne, a good friend of mine, in fact, and somebody who has worked as a senior civil servant in the Welsh administration around education. Erstwhile, I must say. Alan, first of all, would you like to say hello to us?
Hello.
Well, it's a real privilege to have you with us. Now, I wonder if we could maybe start. We often talk to teachers, and I go up and down the country and I talk obviously to parents and to teachers about all sorts of things. Very rarely do I get to talk to somebody on the other side of the fence, somebody from the administrative perspective in government or who's had that experience. Do you want to tell us, first of all, just a little bit about your education? I know you've had quite a wide and varied career, but your educational experience with Education Department and government in Wales.
Okay. Perhaps uniquely, certainly in the current times, I was what they call a career civil servant. I left school having done my GCSEs and entered the civil service, and basically worked my way up from the bottom rung, and after about 20 years, became part of the senior civil service and what people perhaps euphemistically describe as Whitehall Mandarins. My initial role as a senior civil servant was in the European part of the office, and I was responsible for negotiating with the European Commission, and that I did for a number of years. But my most substantive period was in the education department, where I remained for some 10 years. And my principal achievements, if you can describe them as that, was to introduce into Wales the new foundation phase and early years education for 3 to 7 year olds. But also I had a wider portfolio of responsibilities as well. I think as I said, my main achievement was introducing the foundation phase, early years education into the Welsh education system. To do that, I mean, it was very much in response to a government manifesto commitment, but I was then tasked to actually implement it. And as a result, we introduced phase for 3 to 7 year olds. But of course, there was no infrastructure in place to accommodate them at the time. So again, we had to work alongside local education authorities, principally, also the voluntary sector, to inject a significant amount of financial resource in the system, and to ensure that it could actually operate. So we have a system in place now where all 3 year olds have an entitlement to education which is age appropriate, because much of the education that they would experience is based on outdoor activities and so on and so forth. But for me, that was a major achievement.
So if I can explore that a little bit. So when you did this and when you were looking at this, what were the kind of, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind that, 3 to 7 year olds, there's that phrase, isn't there? Give me a child until he's 7 and I'll give you the adults. They're very, very malleable minds, and really many people see children in the current cultural discussion that we're having as the key battleground. How you can You can't influence older people, you can't influence families, but actually if you can influence children in certain cultural ways, then actually they'll grow up accepting those things. And so many people see it as a key battleground. Was that the view back then when you were implementing a curriculum, that actually this is an ideological battleground?
I think from ministers' perspective, it was to improve educational attainment. And because of that, they felt that the earlier that a child could be exposed to um, fundamental basic educational principles, the more that it would become embedded in their psyche. I
So
mean,
we're talking reading, writing, and
yeah,
arithmetic. Yeah.
give you a personal example. Yesterday, we spent most of the day with my eldest son in Bath, and he has a daughter who is now 3.5, and we spent most of the day with her. Um, and you could see that she had an appetite, if you like, for learning, even at the age of 3. And it was encouraging for us. My wife is a professional teacher, or is retired now, but to uh, give her that basis, I suppose, so that when she does eventually go to school, which she should be shortly, then she would have the fundamental principles in mind. And I think this was very much at the back of what ministers certainly had in mind, that they wanted to improve educational attainment. They felt that exposing uh, younger people rather than the then 5-year-olds would give them that added advantage. And I think there is some evidence emerging that that has proved to be the case. So to go back to the phrase that you cited earlier, I think there is a strong evidence base to that. Um, I think one of the things that we were keen to do in developing the curriculum for that age range was to ensure that not only did they have reading, writing, arithmetic sort of thing, but also that they had a wider appreciation of what we probably now describe as PHSE, fundamentals of how do you live life well and appropriately. And again, I think an age appropriate element in the foundation phase was actually to give children a wider understanding that life isn't just tangible things we see around us. There is another element as well, and we would obviously describe it as a spiritual element.
And that sounds very, very reasonable, and makes a lot of sense. And until you find that where we seem to have got to today, and I think it was yesterday or today at the time of recording that the First Minister in Wales has confirmed that trans women are women. So any man, for example, who decides that he's a woman, therefore now is considered in the First Minister's eyes as a woman. Well, that's interesting insofar as those kind of things are entering into the curriculum in Wales, even for younger children. And many parents object to that sort of thing. Well, actually, we don't think that's the case. We think that's a hotly contested political, ideological idea that we disagree with, and we don't want our children being taught. But the problem is, in Wales, the right to remove children from that kind of education has been removed. Education being a devolved issue in Wales, of course. And so, we then seem to have moved way beyond the conveyance of these objective ideas of learning and the foundations for education, so you can learn how to learn, into being taught what to think and what you need to accept, as opposed to how to find your own evidence yourself. Just wondering how you think that change has come about, and other civil servants, your peers, your counterparts, your successors, will they be banging their heads against the wall thinking, what are we doing? Or will they be, in fact, leading and embracing this, do you think?
Yeah. Well, to give you an example, one of the ministers that I worked with um, was very keen back in that day um, to do away with the what was euphemistically described as Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which very much constrained what local authorities could do in terms of the equalities agenda and so on. As a civil servant, I was able, because it was against my particular conscience and belief system, to stay that particular repeal for a number of years. However, it was during a period when, uh, having looked to civil servants for their main advisors, ministers were bringing in special advisors who were individuals who thought very much along their own way. And so the advice of, even in my time, the advice of civil servants was beginning to become less relevant to certain ministers. And they would look instead to their unelected special advisors to advise on particular issues. And of course, being, I say, in the same image, if you like, as the ministers, they would automatically agree almost with what the ministers would want. And so there wasn't that temporary any longer of individual ministers' approaches. Now, as it happens, ironically, Mark Drakeford was that minister's special advisor. And so they thought very similarly along many lines. And he then eventually went into politics and is first minister today, and very much is in a position of great authority.
It's interesting. You should. The way things work is quite interesting because I was talking to somebody in Scotland who made the observation that, well, actually, the reason why Scotland and of course now Wales seem to be, as some people might see it, ahead of the game in some of these ironically called progressive ideas, is that often the administrations don't have the same checks and balances as there might exist in Westminster, for example, via the House of Lords and other methodologies, in that we just don't have that. So a minister is free to appoint his own or her own, quotes, independent panel of advisors who are people who feel very much the same way as they do. And even when, so let's take, for example, the removal of the parental right of withdrawal to certain aspects of education. Twice the public were asked in Wales, do you think this is a good idea? And twice they overwhelmingly said no. But of course, you know, the minister then relies on their own independent, quote unquote, group of specialists who have been handpicked, who say, well, of course it's a good idea and we must do it for these reasons. And then they go ahead and do it anyway. So yeah, I suppose, I mean, I don't want to jump to my what's always my last question, which is what on earth do we do? Because that's always a challenge. But I know there are other groups in Wales who are groups of parents, and let's be quite plain, our supporters at Coalition for Marriage come from all faiths and none. And a lot of these parents in this particular group I'm thinking about in Wales who have been given leave for a judicial review of the decision around excluding parents and teaching sorts of things that they don't want young children to be taught. That's an interesting, you know, how would you have felt as a civil servant back in the day if the curriculum you'd implemented for 3 to 7 year olds had been given leave for a judicial review? Such was the level of objection to it among the population.
Personally, I would have, in one sense, welcomed that because it gives the opportunity for the wider parental body to actually comment on it. I mean, the major problem we have is, or we had, was that we were very much relying on the views of a finite number. And although we did go out to consultation on the consultation phase for about 3 months from memory, it didn't elicit a great response, surprisingly. And again, I think that in itself has a lesson that if we have strong views on a particular issue, then we need to express them. There is almost a view amongst society today, well, there's no pointing us comment, because, as you alluded to earlier, the government have either already decided on what they want to do, or they will do it anyway. Back again in the day, there was this understanding that if you had, say, half a dozen people write in objecting to something, then ministers would say, fine, okay. If you had 100 people write in, better think about this. If you had 1,000 people write in, then they'd stop.
Yeah.
They were pragmatic enough, like, to stop. And there must be something in their views. Whether that still exists, I do not know. I think ministers and the wider special advisor network and so are so committed to certain ideas that they do it without regard. I mean, going back to the example you cited, we had that proposal to ban smacking, reasonable chastisement. And I think it was the Christian Institute who commissioned independent survey of the parental views, and well over 70% said leave it as it is. And we recognize that occasionally you will get excesses, but we understand, we believe that parents do have responsibility for bringing up their children in a way that is right.
So you've raised a couple of really interesting points there. The first one about so when I do have the privilege of speaking to quite a number of MPs and policymakers, and the MPs particularly say the thing that means the biggest difference to them is when individuals get in touch with them personally, their constituents get in touch, and that does. So if we write as an organisation representing however many tens of thousands of people, well, it's still considered as one letter. But if individuals get in touch, they say it really has an impact. But I think we also, a challenge that we've got, many of our supporters quite often write in and say, oh, why don't you get a survey or a poll up, and get people to vote? The problem is, it's so easy to do that these days. It's so easy to electronic communication, to sign up to a petition is almost like, what do we have? In just a matter of hours, millions of people saying Jeff Bezos shouldn't be allowed back to Earth when he went up in his space rocket. Nonsense like that just takes place. And it's so easy that often these things aren't given the credibility that they used to have. For example, back in the day, we keep using that phrase, when the same-sex so-called marriage debate was being had, I think we had well over 600,000 signatures. And then that was people literally writing their names and addresses on a form. And that being verified and checked for accuracy. You don't get that anymore. You can get that number of signatures via a Twitter poll in no time at all. And as a consequence, people don't treat that stuff with the same sort of relevancy and credibility that it used to have, if you like. So you raise an interesting point about how we make our feelings heard. And, one of those things which you also mentioned is that aspect of individually writing into individual people and making individual comments. That's still really appreciated. So let's encourage people to carry on doing that.
But going back to the point you just made, I think you're right. You're absolutely right. But it's only when it suits ministers. I mean, going back to the ban on smacking, for instance, their view was that they were doing the right thing because the NSPCC had said that was the right thing to do, to ban smacking. Well, again, you're differentiating between organizations now simply because the NSPCC said it was right to ban smacking then in ministers' minds, it was right to ban smacking. When the Marriage for Coalition said, um, you know, it's a man and a woman, that's the basis of a relationship. Well, no, well, that doesn't fit into our modern thinking. That doesn't fit into what we're being told by other organizations. And because of that, I mean, it's part of the wider debate of living in a secular, pluralistic society.
Yeah.
Now, in a pluralistic relative society, anyone's views of equal relevance. They believe in God or they don't believe in God, doesn't really matter. And I think that's partly where, well, not partly, that's where society has greatly departed. We do not have any longer absolutes which the vast majority of people sign up to.
And that's the thing. And once you lose that objective measure for morality, it then comes down to who's shouting the loudest. And it so happens that the preponderance, the tiny, and it is a literally, and we've shown in other videos and in other messages, the tiny minority, which the perception is much bigger than it actually is. But the tiny minority are often the people with the microphone and end up controlling the agenda. Just because they've got their microphone, and it isn't completely appropriate.
I mean, you can say that, I mean, I don't want to pick on any particular areas, but I mean, with the LGBT agenda now, I mean, if you look at the censuses, the number of people who describe themselves as such is 1 or 2% from memory. What about the other 98%? And yet the LGBT community, and you've got to be very careful here, they seem to have the sway into the equalities agenda.
Can I pick up on something else you mentioned or alluded to? And this is the issue of whether or not the state still sees parents as the chief educator, the primary educator of their own children. Now, in Wales particularly, we've had, as you mentioned, a smacking ban. So the state thinks, well, actually, we know better than parents about loving discipline for children. We know better than those who know their children. And also now, of course, we've had this concept of, well, also we know how to educate your children better than you do. So you no longer have the right of withdrawal. It's up to us what we teach them, and you have no say in that. Well, it seems to me that the state is saying, actually, parents are no longer the primary educators of their children. We are. Do you think that's a correct assumption? And if so, what on earth do we do about that as parents?
I couldn't categorically say that that is the majority view of government. But I think there are indicators that suggest that that could well be the case, because one of my other roles was as registrar of independent schools in Wales, and there are about 45 of them from memory. It's not insignificant that the government in Wales does not really support the independent sector. Unlike England, where there are some financial resources, as I understand, available for the independent sector, that's not the case in Wales. If you want to set up a school, okay, fair enough, we'll go along with it, but don't look to us for any support. One of the major hurdles that was difficult to overcome was that there was no financial support from government, and therefore the immense capital cost, if you like, that was involved was a major hurdle. So there are indicators that, as you say, that we know best what we provide, what is best for the child, as parents who happen to know the children individually well and know their strengths and weaknesses and all that.
So many people, and we'll conclude with this. You've got stuff on your agenda. I completely appreciate the time you've given us, but many people are looking at things and saying, surely we're due a correction, some kind of pendulum swinging back. And I'm wondering, how do you think those parents listening in England, Scotland, as well as Wales and Northern Ireland, who are thinking, well, what on earth do we do? We're not happy with what's going on. What advice would you give to people? How can you best influence civil servants, ministers, the agenda going forward, given all the constraints that we've mentioned? Is there anything you'd advise us?
Well, one of the areas is the obvious one of making their views individually known to ministers and to senior civil servants as well, but to ministers in particular, by writing, taking opportunities to attend consultation meetings and so on, to actually have the courage, if you like, of their convictions, and to stand up and say, no, we do not believe this is right. You as are elected, and that's at the end of the day what they are. They are the elected representatives. This is what we want you to deliver.
And what about, is there any merit in encouraging people to get involved in other aspects of the establishment, whether it be school governors, volunteering, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. I know members of school governing bodies. My son over in England is, and it's a way of influencing the delivery, if not the shape of what is delivered in that particular school. The difficulty always is that you're more at the sharp end there, and what you're delivering is what the government has already enacted. So in case of Wales, you've got the RVE, the RSE, and so on.
And what about providing alternatives? One of the issues that we've got is, of course, that teachers are very, very busy, and there's constant missives coming out from education departments that heads have got to try and follow and cascade down to teachers, and life is just very, very busy, and there's a lot of pressure. And some organisation comes in and says, hey, we'll deliver that lesson for you, or here's some free resources. And of course, those resources and those lessons are skewed towards what is often a highly activist-driven organisational agenda, which is ideological in basis. But the teacher often just hasn't got time to look or think about that and just says, oh, yes, please, thank you very much. So what about, in fact, if parents get involved in that sort of thing? Much harder, I know, but maybe there are people out there who could organise themselves and come up with some kind of objective material which perhaps isn't quite as skewed as other stuff.
No, I agree with that.
I think a lot of people, a lot of individuals, even though, people in the kind of the more popular cultural debating sphere will say, well, we're not Christians in the sense we don't believe in the ethereal aspects, but we recognise that actually it's a good moral standard to build a society on. And, a lot of people are in that kind of bracket. And so they would put themselves down maybe from that perspective.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree entirely. The big danger, of course, is that you open the door to organizations who, as you rightly say, take a contrary view. Okay, it's easy for me to sit here and say that this morning. But I think it's important, particularly with the constraints that exist on public expenditure, on education, time, etc., that you do engage with external organizations. And as Christians, we ought to be at the forefront of engaging with schools, going in, leading RE lessons, PHSE lessons, whatever they're called nowadays.
Well, Alan Lansdowne, what a source of common sense and reason you are. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time. My only hope is that there are civil servants just like you sat there in the background doing everything they can to influence things around a much more normalised, sensible agenda. Thank you very much for your time, and very best for the holiday coming up next week.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.